I was wondering where Ulysses' tie went. Ezra, we're restricting your questions this morning. Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a good night's sleep and ate your Wheaties this morning, because we're doing it again. I am delighted to introduce the first session today with Elissa, Author, speaking about Josh Faught. And then we're going to have Joanna Marsh speak after that, our own contemporary art curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And then we're going to have, I think, what's going to be quite a lively panel moderated by Elena Buszek. And so we will hold questions for this session until the panel is over, and then we'll have Joanna and Elissa come back up to the stage. So, Elissa.
Okay. Thank you, Nicholas. I'm delighted to be here and kicking off today's proceedings, and I think we're going to have a wonderful very interesting sort of series of papers on the subject of craft and contemporary culture. Let me go forward here. Josh Faught has long associated his work with the past in a way that moves readily between personal history and social history, and his most recent solo exhibition at the Lisa Cooley Gallery in New York was no exception. And you're seeing an installation shot here. Faught titled the show Longtime Companion, as in he is survived by his longtime companion, the euphemism applied by the New York Times and other mainstream news outlets to surviving same-sex partners in obituaries of gay men in the early years of the AIDS crisis. Longtime Companion was also the title of the first feature-length film about AIDS to receive wide distribution in the US. Released in 1990 and directed by Norman Renee, the film charts the devastation of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s through the personal, interconnected stories of a group of gay men residing in New York City. Norman's decision to build his narrative around his characters' emotional challenges in response to AIDS, ranging from fear, denial, and shame to acceptance and grief, came under fire from the film industry critics and AIDS activists as cliched, sentimental, and politically compromised. With the rise of ACT UP in the late 1980s and its promotion of a brand of activism that sought to convert individual grief over the loss of friends, lovers, and community with collective anger over government inaction, AIDS representations like Longtime Companion, as well as popular forms of mourning such as the candlelight vigil, were increasingly shunned as ineffectual, irrelevant, and even embarrassing. With these references in mind, Faught's installation, Longtime Companion, captures a moment in the mid-1980s to early 1990s surrounding the representational politics of AIDS. This moment is explored by Faught alongside the history and practice of craft, as incongruous, even trivial as the pairing might seem. These histories do, in fact, directly intersect in Faught's Longtime Companion in one place. In woven replicas of a portion of the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, the largest ongoing community fiber project in the world dedicated to the memorialization of people lost to the AIDS pandemic. Let me see which slide. Okay, you see that over on the right-hand side there, and I think I have a detail of that. There we go, it's on the left. Like the film Longtime Companion, the AIDS Memorial Quilt's sentimentality and its function as a vehicle for grieving was received with skepticism by AIDS activists, not to mention the art world, where the same attributes were and continue to be regarded as the hallmarks of non-art. And just as an example, this was one of the posters that ACT UP used at one of the showings of the quilt. Let me go back here. As many observers and supporters of the quilt have noted, its aesthetic and emotional power is in the very terms of its dismissal. For instance, its amateur quality is a form of craft that highlights human touch and fosters emotional connections to making and materials. Faught's signature style of decoratively dense, eccentric making in fiber is similarly charged, and throughout his installation, craft is harnessed for a broad investigation of dismissed or suppressed histories, lifestyles, and feelings. Faught's longtime companion consists of a group of 8 wall-mounted fiber works and 2 large identical cedar structures occupying the gallery's center. The fiber works, and I'll give you a couple of examples. On the right-hand side, Division Destroys Dreams, or no, sorry, that's on the left, and then on the right-hand side, Laugh, But Someday We'll Be in Charge, both from 2011. So the fiberworks feature Faught's distinctive, loose, pieced, asymmetrical or irregular weavings with crocheted pods and pockets, webs, drape fabric, fringe, frayed knots, sequins, and loose threads. A cochineal dye is the source of the work's color palette, ranging from blood red to soft petal pink. These works also extend his previous use of buttons with tongue-in-cheek catchphrases like "destined to be an old broad with plenty to bitch about" and "call me a romantic, but I still give head." Other works, such as Calendar, you see Calendar on the left and detail on the right, which include personal mementos like greeting cards received from his mother and grandmother, reference the passing of time and seasonal transitions. Also related to Faught's iconography of transitions is his use of the colonial American reversible weaving technique known as summer and winter in a series of woven bands, and I'll show you those in one moment. Elsewhere, works appear backwards or reappear in reverse. Housed within the wooden structures, which combine a closet and shelving in a single unit, are a series of books and sundry tchotchkes. The structure titled Summer, this is the one that's in the foreground, the full title is Summer, and then in parentheses, Donna Z. Milak, contains a collection of books written by Milak, the foremost author of very popular how-to craft publications of the 1970s and 80s, now for sale on Amazon for as little as 99 cents. Encased within the exterior frame of Summer is a woven replica of a Parents, Family, and Friends of Gays and Lesbians PFLAG newsletter from the summer of 1995, the year Faught himself came out. Summer also houses 2 felt replicas of plaid long-sleeve shirts illustrated in another how-to publication, Beverly Gordon's Felt Making. And on the right-hand side, you see the back of the cover of that book and the shirt that Faught has copied. The pair of shirts immediately brings to mind Brokeback Mountain, arguably the most famous of sentimental gay films, and the tear-jerking scene where Innes discovers his lost shirt hung with the one belonging to his deceased lover, Jack, who had preserved them in his childhood bedroom. Innes lifts the shirts to his face and silently weeps. You see the promotional poster for Brokeback Mountain on the right, and then the installation of the shirts at the Gene Autry Museum. On the shelf above the shirts is a fabric-covered jar labeled Josh's Lip Gloss. Let me see if I have, there you see it a little bit on the top right, among other homemade gifts. Soft sculptures of pies rest on the floor and on the top of the structure. A duplicate wooden structure titled Winter and Rule is Summer's pair and includes another series of books, in this case Rule's True Crime Investigations, duplicates of the felt shirt shown from the rear and in reverse pattern, and another PFLAG newsletter from the winter of 1995. The show's centerpiece is the monumental "It Takes a Lifetime to Get Exactly Where You Are," a 20-foot-long assemblage of woven bands and panels with applied buttons, sequins, hanging bells, adhesive letters and numbers, aromatic cedar blocks, and a woman's straw hat. 2 dried gourds and a lifelike ceramic cat sit on the floor in front of the work. The right end of It Takes a Lifetime consists of the commercially woven replica of a segment of the AIDS memorial quilt that I introduced above. It highlights some of the quilt's most distinctive features, including the placement of panels devoted to celebrities, in this case Liberace, next to those of ordinary citizens, the tombstone convention of birth and death dates, and the creative cacophony of the juxtaposition of personalized handmade panels. And I think I might have meant to put that detail up there. Although its creation is ongoing, the Names AIDS Memorial Quilt is socially and politically rooted in the early years of the AIDS epidemic, between 1984, when the project was conceptualized, and 1996, when AIDS fatalities and new infections finally began to decline. Without effective treatment yet available, within this period, approximately 388,253 people had died of AIDS, and over 500,000 were infected with HIV, the large majority of them gay men between the ages of 20 and 49. People with AIDS, HIV were under constant assault from those who advocated for their quarantine, discrimination in housing and employment, or refusal of public health care dollars for their care. The trauma and the staggering loss of life and hostile political climate for people with AIDS was compounded in this period by inaction on the part of the US government, including that of President Ronald Reagan, who did not officially acknowledge the epidemic until 1987. Projects dedicated to remembering and documenting the early years of AIDS and its associated emotional traumas have only just begun to surface in the art world, some 25 years after the discovery of the HIV virus in humans. Examples include NYU's exhibition Grand Fury, Read My Lips, the first comprehensive survey documenting the important AIDS activist art collectives work from 1987 to 1995. It's a detail of some of the works from that show. And ICA Boston's This Will Have Been, Art, Love, and Politics in the 1980s, a critically rigorous assessment of the art of the 80s shaped in response to the period's two quote-unquote open wounds. This is coming from the introductory chapter of the catalog. Those open wounds being the AIDS crisis and the social, political, and cultural transformations brought about by feminism. And I'm just showing you general ideas, AIDS wallpaper, which was included in that exhibition. Now, in these examples, among others, the visual representation of AIDS is dominated by an agit-prop style that visually complemented ACT UP's direct confrontational modes of protest. These historicizing efforts share the goal of recovering a particular moment in the history of the gay community that has passed and that many fear is subject to disappearance as the early association of AIDS with gay men wanes and the virus is more and more accepted as a chronic but manageable condition. As another project involved in this recovery effort, Faught's Longtime Companion stands out for its distinctive approach to this history. Unlike the recent revival of interest in the art and heroic activism of ACT UP, Faught's installation focuses on forms of activism hardly recognized as such. For instance, forms of caregiving and grassroots networks of support that are not easily integrated into official histories and often subject to dismissal as merely creative, ameliorative, or apolitical. In this regard, Faught was inspired by another recent retrospective look at AIDS, David Weissman's 2011 documentary, We Were Here. The film is also a first of its kind for its reflective and emotional look back at the arrival and devastation of AIDS in San Francisco through the personal stories of 5 individuals, 4 men and 1 woman, who lived through it as caregivers, from positions as a professional nurse, volunteer hospice worker, lover and primary caretaker at home, neighborhood florist providing discount funeral arrangements, and a grassroots community organizer. Faught attended the film's premiere in San Francisco at the Castro Theater, a landmark institution in the historically gay Castro neighborhood. And in a recent phone interview, he remarked how, in this context, the screening functioned as a very moving public form of mourning. The stories told in We Were Here enabled this function by approaching the psychological, cultural, and social devastation wrought by AIDS upon the gay male community through lived experiences and feelings generally absent from the histories of the epidemic. Weissman validated these experiences and feelings through their inclusion in the film as legitimate forms of historical evidence, a strategy that finds a non-narrative parallel in Faught's Longtime Companion through the installation's combination of historical yet otherwise unremarkable ephemera and an approach to craft that accentuates fiber's tactile relationship to the body and its myriad cultural associations with the home, family and private life, security, and comfort. In Faught's installation, let's see if I can go back there. The ephemera primarily appears in the form of micro-archives, documenting networks of care and support that have been translated or integrated into fiber, preserving and enhancing a variety of emotional attributes. The archive of networks includes the woven replica of the AIDS quilt, how-to craft books, the woven PFLAG newsletters, buttons, greeting cards, other books, and an array of fiber techniques. And you just see a sort of sample of them here. Within Longtime Companion, these archival elements all represent forms of support, some of which extend to networks and the creation of communities and identities. These archives are remnants of cultural traces and lifestyles that sit uncomfortably within the historical record, but they are brought alive through the medium of fiber and Faught's hand manipulation of this medium, which invests them with a renewed affective character. If the replica of the AIDS quilt is the most recognizable archival passage in Longtime Companion, one of the more obscure and humorous, at least to me, having worked on fiber for so many years, is the example of the Donna Z. Milak Library, arguably the most prominent author of a genre that has defined craft culture as a lesser artistic form since its inception. And I just have inserted a detail there of some of the more well-known books, at least within fiber circles, that Milak produced. With this collection, Faught recuperates a moment in craft's history dating from the late 1960s and 1970s, marked by studio craft's bid for artistic status, a revival of craft within the counterculture, and the related popular spread of hobby-based craft amongst the general public. In the period, the question of whether the embrace of craft by the counterculture and amateur makers was good or bad for the professional craft artists was debated with much angst in the pages of Craft Horizon, among other venues. And as anyone who has interviewed a crafts professional who has struggled to legitimate his or her work as art in this period knows, the latter phenomenon, encompassing as forms as diverse as embroidered clothing, hand-built homes, macrame, ceramic wares of all sorts, was often regarded as that which gave craft a bad name. From this perspective, Milak's how-to books might be said to represent the ground zero of craft's shame and embarrassment. As tremendous as it was, the popular surge of craft in this period has never been part of its canonical history, owing partly to this shame. Faught's own history as an artist is implicated here. The artist has variously explained the way his encounters with craft at summer camp, as a fiber student at the industry-oriented Fashion Institute of Technology, and then subsequently as a graduate student in the more theoretically open context of material studies at the School of the Art Institute, and then finally in the established medium-specific art world of fiber art, where he has been received as something of a gadfly, contributed to his irreverent bricoleur approach to craft. His amalgam of attention to technique and simultaneously the look of improvisational free play in loose ends and visible joins, the elevation of low forms like crochet, and the juxtaposition of all manners of inharmonious materials illustrates Faught's own complicated relationship to aesthetic normativity. His work, to use the words of Lauren Berlant regarding the affect of shame, is, quote, a declaration of the freedom to give up getting legitimacy in normal terms, end quote. In other words, it is shameless. Another archive appears in the series of woven bands with phrases like police at the door, unwanted marks, and difficulty breathing. And those are incorporated into It Takes a Lifetime to get exactly where you are, and I'm showing you a detail on the left there. These are the chapter titles of the how-to guide, Dungeon Emergencies and Supplies, when you see the cover on the right, picked up by Faught in a store catering to the gay leather subculture. The woven bands, and I have another detail there. The woven bands produced in the summer and winter technique are a visual translation of the potential reversal of pleasure into disaster in the sex play dungeon, symbolized in a reversible weave pattern. Works like Laugh All You Want, but Someday We'll Be in Charge, which is on the left, or Untitled, made of piece and sutured felt blankets, actual disaster blankets, further the theme of the reversal of fortune in the installation, a subject to which I'll return in just one second. back to the bands. The author of Dungeon Emergencies and Supplies, Jay Weissman, is something of a Donna Z. Milak of the BDSM community, with 11 books, 3 videos, a popular workshop program, and a website full of additional resources for the lifestyle to his credit. On his website, he also records the history of the San Francisco BDS community's vexed relationship to the sexual mainstream, both gay and straight, in the 1960s and 70s as a shameful perversion, a story that in its general contours mirrors that of the craft world's disavowal of popular and DIY practices. What is often considered one of the more elusive aspects of Faught's work, generally the buttons, are also fruitfully considered as a kind of support network for the socially marginal. In some cases, their passive-aggressive humor is the stock and trade of the beleaguered administrative assistant, as in the popular "your deadline is not my emergency," type declaration, that keeps a lid on the just below the surface anger about power relations in the workplace. Other buttons, some of them showing you here, capture politically incorrect feelings and desires or compensate for personal disappointment and frustration, as in, I don't drink, I don't dance, I hate astrology, and I have no phone. Their inclusion in Longtime Companion, as in all Faught's work where they appear, functions as a form of address that establishes an I speaking to a you, and imbues the techniques of crochet, weaving, and sewing, techniques historically associated with non-art, with a pathos even more alien to the contemporary art world and their speaking subjects' desire for recognition. The attachment of the buttons to the surface of the works also supports another connection between craft and social networks organizing Longtime Companion. For Faught, and I'm quoting him here, there's something about the process of crochet and weaving that lends itself to accumulation and collection. I really do see a lot of these works as a kind of hand-spun pegboard, like the kind that people hang in their garages, with all the tools you need for survival or just to get through the day, end quote. And he goes on to say that, quote, craft on all levels, particularly those crafts taught in Donna Milak's books, also function as a kind of support system in that way, end quote. Lest the viewer of Longtime Companion try losing himself or herself in the hopeful self-help declarations, the utopian aspirations of the how-to book, or comforting materials and memorials, Faught undercuts it all with an equally sinister iconography of disaster blankets. You see one on the right here. Blood red, cochineal soaked crochet. Anne Rule's books about neighbors and coworkers who turn out to be serial killers. Disease, personality disorder, and sexual encounters gone terribly awry. In Longtime Companion, there is a thin line between the affective states associated with pleasure and danger. Ultimately, Faught shows us that fiber is just as easily marshaled for discomfort and fear as it is for nostalgia and belonging. Thank you.
Thank you very much for starting us off this morning. Joanna. Joanna Marsh is the Curator of Contemporary Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Good morning. As Nicholas said, I'm Joanna Marsh, the Curator of Contemporary Art here at the American Art Museum, and it's a pleasure to be part of this symposium. Thank you to Nicholas and Katie for organizing such a terrific two-day event. And I also want to acknowledge my intern, Gabriel Quick, who has helped me tremendously compile slides and other material for this talk. So thanks, Gabe. It's certainly an honor to be part of this dynamic conversation today, although I must admit feeling like something of an interloper on these proceedings. I am by no means a craft expert on either the history or practice of craft, and I am indebted to several of my fellow participants, in particular Glenn Adamson, Elissa, Author, and Elena Buszek, for their trailblazing work on the intersection of contemporary art and craft, all of whom I have read extensively in preparation for this presentation. I do have, however, a strong interest in both process-oriented and conceptually rigorous work. And over the last several years, I've found myself increasingly gravitating towards a number of contemporary artists who engage with traditional craft practices and techniques. Materials typically identified with craft, such as wood, clay, fiber, are today serving as artistic tools for a burgeoning generation of practitioners. This morning, I'm going to discuss in brief 3 such artists, Ghada Amer, Charles Ledray, and Alison Elizabeth Taylor. But before I begin, I'd like to discuss a recent event that suggests the increasing openness within the contemporary art world to craft and craft practices. Earlier this week, the American Art Museum announced the 2012 recipient of our biannual Contemporary Artist Award, New York-based sculptor Kathy Butterly. Butterly is the 10th winner of this $25,000 award, which recognizes an American artist under the age of 50. She was selected from a pool of 15 nominees by an independent jury, and she was chosen for her richly communicative and wildly imaginative ceramic sculptures. Here you see one entitled Fall into Spring from 2004. Small, nuanced, and labor-intensive, each enigmatic work balances between humor and horror, seduction and repulsion, abstraction and figuration. Butterly masterfully harnesses these tensions to transform the familiar into something strange. In the studio, each sculpture begins as a simple vessel, cast from porcelain and subjected to countless mutations, collapses, and augmentations. Many resemble cartoonish forms based on the human body, endowed with appendages such as bulging bellies, curvaceous bottoms, and painted toes. Butterly's process is both painstaking and unorthodox. Often a single piece will be glazed and fired as many as 20 times, resulting in a sensuously colored surface that conveys as much as it conceals. The selection of Kathy Butterly reflects the increasingly murky divide between contemporary art and craft. Butterly is among a new generation of ceramic artists who have been embraced by contemporary art curators and collectors. Current ceramic sculpture is a very different affair from its predecessors of the 1950s and 60s. And here you see a Viola Frey and a Robert Arneson, both from our collection. The radical experiments of Viola Frey and Robert Arneson, both of whom Kathy Butterly studied under, have given way to a craft-based practice that is direct and unapologetic. And as an aside, I thought it was interesting to note, especially in light of Julie and Jennifer's talk yesterday, the sort of arbitrary institutional divisions and departmental designations between craft and contemporary art are still evident within our own collection, where Viola Frey's work, Lady in Blue and Yellow Dress, is typically exhibited at the Renwick Gallery, whereas Robert Arneson's 35-year portrait is traditionally shown here in the Patent Office building as part of our 3rd floor contemporary art installation. Going back to the work of Arneson and Frey, as our keynote speaker Glenn Adamson has observed in the catalog for the 2009 exhibition Dirt on Delight at the ICA Philadelphia, the generation, quote, the generation of the 1950s assumed that pottery was a problem, something to be overcome. Today's ceramic artists, by contrast, seem to ask, why on earth should we be ashamed of this material or of studio practice more generally? Gone is the, quote, excruciating irony of so many of Arneson's self-portraits. Rather than staging an assault on their medium, today's ceramic sculptures seem to embrace its manifold possibilities. To my somewhat untrained eyes in this field, it would appear that the same can be said of the evolution in fiber and textile arts over the last 40 years. Practices traditionally derided as women's work, i.e. sewing, quilting, weaving, knitting, and crochet, have witnessed a renaissance within the contemporary art world, easily evidenced by the sheer number of artists and variety of fiber and textile works featured in the 40 Under 40 exhibition. And here you see 4 such artists. But the eventual ascendancy of fiber-based practices and their legitimization as a medium of fine art did not come without a fight. Beginning in the early 1970s, the hierarchy of art and craft came under intense scrutiny as women fought for inclusion in the mainstream art world. As Elissa, Author, describes in her book String Felt Thread, quote, artists participating in the burgeoning feminist movement refused to let the negative associations of craft go unchallenged. Several leading artists, chief among them Miriam Schapiro and Judy Chicago, reclaimed fiber and textile traditions that had been diminished and dismissed as humble handcraft. Miriam Shapiro's adoption of traditional fiber arts and women's material culture began with her involvement in the California Institute of the Arts Feminist Art Program, which she co-founded with Judy Chicago. Shapiro is perhaps best known for her canvases of the 1970s and 80s that incorporate mass-produced textiles, lace, crocheted doilies, embroidered handkerchiefs, tea towels, and aprons. She called these collage paintings Femage. Wonderland, which you see here from the American Art Collection, illustrates Shapiro's technique of bringing visibility, awareness, and aesthetic value to women's traditional art forms and cultural objects. Similarly, Judy Chicago's exploration and appropriation of women's traditional arts began in the early 70s, and as Elissa has written, emerged alongside a larger artistic project of recovering and preserving the history of women's cultural and political achievements, which culminated in her piece, The Dinner Party, which you see here. Elissa has given particular attention in her book to The Dinner Party and its significance as one of the most memorable works of feminist art to pose an overt challenge to the hierarchy of art and craft, and in particular to the needlework involved, specifically embroidery, for the runners at each of the place settings. And here you see a detail of one of those place settings for Emily Dickinson. Assisted by artist Susan Hill and a team of needleworkers, Chicago established a process that she hoped would redress the production issues she saw as leading to the devaluation of women's needlework. Chicago's recuperation of embroidery helped to transform culturally entrenched assumptions and associations. Her designs liberated needlework from traditional domestic imagery, and challenged the stereotypical view of embroidery as merely decorative. More importantly, Chicago refused the popular characterization of needlework as a dead art, quoting Elissa here. By recuperating these techniques and materials, Chicago and her feminist peers radically altered the status of fiber in contemporary art, legitimizing it as a medium appropriate to fine art. Today, embroidery seems to be everywhere in the contemporary art world. We're looking at an image by Elaine Reichek, who we'll hear from later in this session on the panel, whose embroidered piece, Who Besides Me, from 2010, is on view with the detail. As well as two other Jenny Hart pieces. Jenny Hart is, of course, featured in the 40 Under 40 exhibition, and her work involves hand embroidery on cotton as well. The 2007 exhibition, Pricked Extreme Embroidery, organized by the Museum of Arts and Design, brought together nearly 50 artists from around the globe to take the pulse of international embroidery as practiced today. Many of the artists continue to use embroidery as a means of interrogating issues of gender, sexuality, and personal experience. This is particularly true in the work of Ghada Amer, who since the early 1990s has been utilizing embroidery and stitching to comment on the stereotypical notions, images, and techniques of femininity as they play out in both the visual arts and everyday life. Amer began to incorporate text into her canvases in 1993, selecting definitions and descriptions of femininity to use as the basis for works like the one you see here, the English translation of which is Beauty Advice. After studying magazines such as Elle and Vogue, which offer endless beauty tips to women, Amer produced this small sculpture consisting of 4 handkerchiefs, each hand embroidered with lines of French text about proper grooming and etiquette. Loose threads hang from the individual words, rendering parts of the text illegible and lending the work an almost abstract quality. Amer here attempts to undercut the mythic ideal perpetuated by these texts through appropriation and ironic transcription. The notion of culturally inscribed gender roles is further questioned in Barbie Loves Ken, Ken Loves Barbie, again, in the English translation of the title, in which Amer declares the imaginary love between Barbie and Ken. Amer repeatedly embroidered this childish refrain onto the stiff canvas surfaces of 2 full body suits, one male and one female, transforming the 2 archetypes of heterosexual bonding into empty shells. The absent bodies, like the vapid text, suggest the dissolution of childhood dreams and the limitations of heterosexual stereotypes. Other descriptions of beauty, femininity, and corporeality find entrance into Amer's work when she reproduces erotic stories and descriptions from both the Western canon of literature and Arabic cultural heritage. Born in Cairo, Egypt, raised in France, and educated in Boston and Paris, Amer brings a decidedly international attitude to her work. In Private Rooms, Amer took all the sentences that speak about women from the Quran and embroidered them in French on sumptuously colored satin wardrobes. By describing all the statements about women, Amer highlights the diversity of viewpoints expressed in the Holy Book and offers a critique of the restrictive attitudes towards women in contemporary Egyptian society. Since the mid-1990s, Amer has also incorporated more direct images of sexuality into her richly textured canvases. She often uses images of women in explicit sexual poses, copied from softcore porn magazines, reproducing a selected image repeatedly across the canvas. The repetition of a selected image also results in the blurring, often rendering it mute or abstract. At the same time, Amer has begun to color her canvases, pouring and blotching paint over parts of the painting before embroidering it. By taking on methods of painting that were first introduced and canonized by abstract expressionists and combining them with the subtle textuality of her intertwined threads, Amer manages to continue her quiet critique of the stereotypes of domesticity, femininity, and sexuality, while simultaneously embracing the contested imagery. Now, lest you think that I only have an interest in women artists who are working with textiles or fiber or weaving, I thought I would show several images, one of which here by male artists who work with fiber and textiles. This here, of course, is Oliver Herring's queen-sized bed from 1993. And 2 images, again, from the Smithsonian American Art Collection and the Renwick Collection. On the left, Mark Newport's Batman 2 from 2005, and on the left, the Nick Cave sound suit, which some of you saw yesterday, which we acquired 2 years ago for the American Art Collection. And I share with my colleague Nicholas Bell. I want to talk now about the work of Charles Ledray. For nearly 20 years, Ledray has been exhibiting work that is distinguished by a masterfully eccentric approach to process and materials. These include drawing, painting, sewing, embroidery, hand-throwing and glazing ceramics, and carving in human bone and ivory. Ledray's dedication to a manually intensive process has yielded a body of work that is emotionally resonant and psychologically complex. Essentially self-taught, Ledray's education consists of a few uncompleted courses at the Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle and years of working as a museum guard at the Seattle Art Museum. Ledray has remarked that, quote, many nights he would leave the Seattle Art Museum with a burning desire to make something, anything, inspired by spending the day with great works of art. This type of solitary engagement with works of art and the intense looking that it encourages are essential characteristics of Ledray's practice and the response his work demands from viewers. In an era of high-tech mass production, Ledray remains committed to a painstaking manual process. But despite his investment in craft techniques, Ledray is quick to dismiss that aspect of his work. And I should note here that when we solicited some additional images from Ledray through his gallery, he declined to submit images to this particular symposium. As James Rondeau has explained in a 2004 catalog on Ledray's work, quote, although he has sewn since the age of 4 and the ethics of handicraft remain foundational to his practice, his work is not about craft. He remains unmoved by now cliched discussions purporting to validate his so-called appropriation of traditional women's work, nor does he intend his art to advance a politicized critique centered on issues of gender or sexuality. Instead, Ledray describes his work, his labor, as the work of a yeoman tailor. The vast majority of Ledray's signature work is diminutive in scale and characterized by an excruciating level of detail. The act of reducing objects is a means of abstracting the real. As Rondeau has written of Ledray's work, he is not shrinking as much as he is transposing a set of material concerns from the everyday into the realm of the imaginary. Representations of clothing, like the piece you see here, have been a central feature of Ledray's work since the early 1990s. Tiny garments seem to imply the complexity of human experience and the various social, cultural, and professional roles that we each inhabit. Clothing as a vehicle for self-expression and self-definition, I think, are at the center of these pieces. Many of his clothes, like this piece, Bust, from 1995, have been deliberately mutilated. Here, Ledray simply snips a completely finished suit, shirt, and tie straight across below the shoulders, transforming the dark pinstripes into an ironic revision of the classic portrait bust. The implied violence of this gesture is repeated in several works of the same period. And here you see Ledray's torn suit and another piece untitled, Suit with a Small Suit Cut from It. In Torn Suit, we see the tattered remains of a tiny jacket and tie ensemble that has been shredded below the chest. And on the right, in Untitled Suit with a Small Suit Cut from It, the seemingly destructive act of cutting a finished object is actually generative. Here, a plaid jacket, striped tie, collared shirt, and pants have been snipped to remove small patches, which are then sewn into an even smaller version of the ensemble. These miniaturized pieces hang from the left cuff of the original suit. This method of embellishing one larger article of clothing with a multitude of tiny garments is evident in several other important works by Ledray. Here, Come Together on the Left from 1995 and Overcoat from 2004 are two ambitious examples of Ledray's fascination with the multiplicity of human identity. It's been suggested that Come Together is an homage to Ledray's mother, a devotee of the 1960s counterculture who passed away in the 1980s. Arching over the small blue denim work shirt embroidered with peace signs, flowers, and doves is a tiny rainbow of blouses, shirts, and skirts, lined up sleeve to sleeve as if holding hands in midair. And it would really be impossible not to acknowledge what Elissa just mentioned, this popular surge in craft during this counterculture movements of the 1960s, which although Ledray has never commented explicitly on this piece, I think must feed into it. This joyful arc of conjoined clothes stands in stark contrast to the stiff, black, vaguely militaristic overcoat the Ledray based on a coat he purchased. Supported by an artist-made hanger, the partially open coat divulges a lining erupting in a riot of colors, prints, and textures. The pocket and cuffs are similarly stuffed with small outfits, 200 in total. This emphasis on repetition and multiplication is further articulated in Ledray's sculpture Milk and Honey, a tightly gathered accumulation of over 2,000 hand-thrown miniature porcelain vessels that Ledray crafted over a period of 2 years. All of the vessels are white and undecorated, emphasizing the forms themselves. And this is just one of a number of similar sculptures that Ledray has made over the last decade or so, some of which are glazed in bright colors, others in which the vessels are just left a kind of matte black. If the human bodies are absent from Ledray's clothes, their skeletal fragments are only too present in his sculptures carved from human bone. Works like Bone Rocker, seen here, and Untitled Tower inevitably introduce themes of mortality and loss, just as they play with the decorative arts traditions. Perhaps a less obvious connection, but equally relevant in the context of our present discussion, is a comparison between Ledray's bone sculptures and the intricately carved ivory objects of the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods. The extraordinary detail and intimate scale of Ledray's precarious bone tower elicits the same sense of awe and close contemplation as a 17th century ivory cup from the Met collection. The recuperation of Renaissance-era artisanal techniques, which were once limited to the collections and Kunstkammers of emperors and princely patrons, has been the focus of Alison Elizabeth Taylor's contemporary marquetry work for the past 7 years. Taylor began inching towards marquetry in 2001, shortly after graduating from Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. At the time, she found some wood grain contact tape in a 99-cent store and began incorporating it into the paintings she was making. 3 years later, after moving to New York City to attend graduate school at Columbia, Taylor visited the Met and happened upon the studiolo from the Ducal Palace in Gubbio, Italy, one of the most important surviving examples of Renaissance intarsia, or marquetry. I have a detail of that as well. Commissioned in the late 15th century by the Duke of Urbino, it is fitted with trompe-l'oeil furniture and cupboards, which you see here, whose open doors reveal objects that tell the patron's life story, items like armor, books, musical and mathematical instruments. And as soon as Taylor saw it, she realized she needed to begin working in real wood. Taylor is attracted to marquetry as much for its cultural history as for its arresting surface detail. Revered in the 16th and 17th century as an adornment for the palaces and studiolos of dukes and popes, as we've seen, marquetry today is more closely associated with the American hobby craft. Taylor harnesses this tension in her work, choosing vernacular subjects that stand in stark contrast with the medium's rarefied past. Taylor taught herself how to work with wood veneers through a combination of internet research, hobby books, and trial and error. In her hands, the sumptuous art of inlay is employed to portray scenes of desolation and despair set in the landscape of the American West. Troubled figures who inhabit her paintings are both haunting and haunted. The piece you see here is entitled Hank from 2007. Many of her pieces are based on memories of traveling through her native Nevada and points west. Hank, in particular, depicts a figure she recalls seeing while visiting the Salton Sea area of California. Once the site of tract homes and motels, which were sold as oceanfront property, the area is now a wasteland for drifters and squatters. Similarly, the idea for Room, an 8 by 10 foot installation, arose in early 2007 on a road trip through the desert in Nevada and California. En route, Taylor was struck by the tiny houses she saw that had been abandoned as tract developments mushroomed nearby. And I have a number of details of this room, which was shown at James Cohen Gallery and is now in a private collection in Connecticut. With the studiolo in mind, Taylor decided to tell the story of one such drifter using only his possessions. The piece here shows all the disparate memorabilia of a man's life: his tools, his microwave, an old army helmet, even photographs, and seen through a doorway, the corner of a solitary camp bed. Taylor's subsequent body of work focused on the rash of foreclosures that spread across the Southwest in 2009-2010. Here you see Squatter Doorway from 2009 on the left, and Shotgun Hole with Additional Vandalism, also from 2009, is on the right. The piece Shotgun Hole with Additional Vandalism incorporates just a tiny bit of acrylic color. And this is something that Taylor is increasingly incorporating into her marquetry pieces. Of course, originally trained as a painter, she has become more and more interested in introducing color back into the marquetry pieces. And the work you see here, Sunset Junction from 2009, is the first in a new series of work investigating nature and natural subjects, most of which incorporate pigmented color. Taylor's work is currently being featured in an exhibition organized by the Museum of Arts and Design entitled Against the Grain: Wood in Contemporary Art, Craft, and Design. The exhibition, which is presently on view at the Mint Museum and will travel to New York this spring, examines the interplay of art and craft, concept and skill, idea and execution. And I feel like Taylor's inclusion in this exhibition and her open embrace of craft traditions and the community from which she draws inspiration is, I think, further evidence of the waning hierarchy between craft and the contemporary art world, and I hope is the future of contemporary art. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. As you can imagine, Joanna and I are actually having a lot of fun working together on things like the Nick Cave acquisition and so on. We're going to have our panel now, and they're getting up here with Maria, Elaine, Sonya, and Michael. And then as soon as they're done, we'll bring Joanna and Elissa back up to the stage. Also, I did forget, as my phone started buzzing this morning, I realized I forgot to tell you all to turn your phones off. So if you could please do so, thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you all for coming. I'm Maria Buszek, and I'm completely thrilled to be up here on stage with these amazing artists who I invited to be part of this panel because of the different ways in which their very different work and very different careers have come to really exemplify what we might consider to be conceptual practices in the field of craft. And so with that in mind, I have lots of questions for them, but I'm very conscious of time because I know that between the two excellent papers we just heard and what these artists will have to say about their work, everyone will have plenty of questions for them. So I want to leave plenty of time at the end for folks to ask questions of everyone. First, though, I wanted to very quickly introduce the artists themselves. Because while I know that their names and their work may be familiar to some, I know that they aren't necessarily to everyone. So I'll start with Sonya Clark. She is renowned for her work in thread, hair, and beadwork. She's a beloved craft educator. In fact, I know many of her students are here to cheer her on today. And she is chair of the Department of Craft and Material Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. I also wanted to say that VCU Arts ranking as the number one United States public school for art is very well known, but lesser known, perhaps, is the fact that under Clark's leadership, her own department, Craft and Material Studies, has been ranked by U.S. News and World Reports as number 4 in fiber, number 5 in glass, 10 in metals, and 12 in clay. So she's
Actually, 9 in clay now.
excuse me, excuse me. Number 9 in clay. She's updating me, as always. So under her leadership, obviously, the program has become even more renowned than ever. Clark holds an MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art, which recently recognized her with its first Distinguished Mid-Career Alumni Award. And she received a BFA at the Art Institute of Chicago and a BA in psychology from Amherst. I'd also like to point out that she graduated from high school here in DC, from Sidwell Friends School. Her work has also been exhibited in over 250 museums and galleries in Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, Australia, and of course throughout the United States. And she's been granted fellowships and grants through such prestigious bodies as the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, Art Matters, Redgate, and the Smithsonian. All of us on this stage are completely geeking out over getting to share it with Elaine Reichek. This is because for nearly 40 years, she's been using thread as a core element in her work, from her early minimalist line paintings with thread on canvas, one of which you see here, to her more recent embroidery and new media works. She is a truly pioneering conceptual artist rethinking the role of craft in fine arts. Reichek was born, raised, lives, and works in New York. And she's exhibited extensively in the United States and abroad, including at such institutions as New York's Museum of Modern Art and the Jewish Museum, the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, the Tel Aviv Museum, and the Wexner Center. And many of you may have also noticed her subtly imposing presence in the 2012 Whitney Biennial, where she was repeatedly singled out among the young punks as showing everyone a thing or two. And her work is in more collections than we could reasonably name today. But highlights include MoMA, the Museum of Arts and Design, the Boston MFA, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts Museum. She is also a Guggenheim Fellow and was recently awarded a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. Michael J. Strand is Associate Professor and head of our token male, as I keep joking today. Is Associate Professor and Head of Visual Arts at North Dakota State University, and to borrow a particularly evocative term from his work, a practitioner of cuplomacy. Formatively a potter, Strand has remained dedicated to traditional object making at the same time as his investigation of craft's potential as a catalyst for social change has become increasingly central to his practice. Strand's beautiful, one-of-a-kind clay cups have been shared by religious leaders and communities across a spectrum of American faiths, left on the doorsteps of rural community members' homes as invitations to an old-school form of social networking, and offered in exchange for those orphan cups we all have in the back of our own cupboards, which Strand realizes often have just as rich a history as those he lovingly throws in his studio. Strand's work has of late been much discussed in the art press, featured in articles in Ceramics, Studio Potter, the Chronicle of Higher Education and Public Art Review, as well as in Nicholas Bell's truly excellent essay, which I'm sure many of you have read, in the Renwick's 40 Under 40 Craft Futures catalog. He also recently discussed his creative philosophy in a TEDx talk titled The Spaces Between Art, Craft, and Humanity. In 2013, he will continue his Misfit Cup Liberation Project at the 2013 NCECA Ceramic Biennial in Houston, and he'll launch a new project on the ritual of the family dinner in the work To Harvest at the Museum of Contemporary Craft in Portland, Oregon this January. So I wanted to begin my questions with a realization that I had after speaking to each of you, both individually and in our correspondences as a group, which we had in the previous month. That it's ironic that while I asked each of them to interview each of them because of how beautifully their careers exemplify a distinguished range of working with craft conceptually, rather than with a focus on materials and a finished exemplary object, i.e. beyond crafting. In my previous conversations with all of them, to a one, they feel great passion about and pleasure in the actual making of the work. In fact, Elaine jokingly referred to herself as the last of the studio dinosaurs. But that said, you all remain focused on handcraft as something that can't be disentangled from your thinking. Elaine, you discussed the haptic process as generative and of, quote, new ideas, additions, corrections, and reversal. And a little known fact is that while she very prominently uses computers in generating her designs, she hand embroiders everything she does. So,
Elissa, I also do employ a digital machine, and in fact, this is digitally sewn. I have one at home, which I can program. And
so I wanted to ask each of you to discuss the ways in which handcraft informs your conceptualism. We always all look to Elaine.
Start here.
age has its privilege. Handwork. First of all, I like doing it. I'm not masochistic. I would prefer to do it in my studio, in my nightgown, rather than having a kind of a little industrial group of fabricators working for me. That said, I don't experience any particular puritanical, grace from it. It's something I like to do. I have made a tapestry in a mill in Belgium. I use a digital machine, and in fact, my concern is in the surface of the handmade. It's the tension between the processes of technology and the hand. In a cross-stitched embroidery, every cross-stitch equals a pixel. And the surface, although I sew the cross-stitch, it refers directly to the digital. In something like Ariadne's Lament, all of those are downloaded from websites where you're supposed to, download something like Johnny's shoes and, somebody's overcoat or whatever. And when I typed in Greek culture, this is what I got. Logos. And so Greek high culture has been reduced to a snarling bull, a weeping eye, and the heads of various teams. And these are, I confess that I know how to program and override them and get them bigger and smaller and work with them the way I like. But I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do a high culture digital sampler? It's that anxiety about making. And the surface of these is flat and shiny. And you don't investigate. It doesn't scream embroidery. It only screams logo or merit badge or something like that. So it's really the difference in the technologies and the combination of the hand and the very old history and the very new history and the translations between these kinds of things that interest me. But the thing that interests me most is sitting in my nightgown sewing, which I really like doing.
So I have the great privilege of working at VCU with some of the most talented colleagues and students I have had the experience of working with in my many years now, I guess 18 years of teaching. And when I took on the position of the chair of the Craft and Material Studies Department, one of the things I realized is that was a lot of position to take on, and I probably wouldn't be in my studio with the privilege of making in the same way that I had in the past. And so this caused a little bit of a problem, but problems are good things, because when you have a problem, then you have to come up with a solution. And I, too, like Elaine, love threading needles and stitching. I can thread a needle behind my back in the dark. Really, I can. You can, too, right? Yeah. We've definitely put our 10,000 hours in with that. But there's something about the making there that is also, when I'm going through the process of making, it's also this time in which ideas rush in. Now, when I took the job, it meant that I didn't have time to make as much, to thread all those needles. So I had to extend my body into this very privileged space of my studio assistants. So I actually do have studio assistants. So the detail of the piece that you're seeing on the left there, one of my studio assistants, who is a VCU alumni, Meg Roberts, she did the stitching of all the hair which is really thread, and then I did the hairdressing. So it's this interesting thing that has happened really in the past 7 years, where I've invited people to be an extension of my hands in some ways. And I really have found myself doing this hierarchy over what I really privilege, like what I won't let the studio assistants do because I really love it. But more recently, I realized that these studio assistants are also in my head. I mean, they're right here, right now. So that there's a comfort level in which we have such a discourse about the making, the mistakes that happen in the making, the mistakes that happen in the thinking around the making, the mistakes that happen in the thinking around the conceptualization of ideas. All of those things, they're both there with me in body and in mind. And so it's actually a really wonderful thing because it becomes a collective experience.
This human machine, I mean,
Yeah.
a different kind of technology.
Yeah. So that's I'll keep going.
Well, first of all, I'm a romantic, and so and that's just from my heart. So when the making of things is just what I have to do. I mean, it's what that response to material, and it's also really related to how you were raised. So I was raised in a ceramic studio and raised as a production potter under a sort of the Mingei tradition. I mean, I went to school in Minnesota. It was heavily influenced, and those things are really part of the kind of, I'd say, DNA of the way that I work. The projects that I do now really just extend the part that I'm most keenly interested in, and that is how something is acquired. And so I really see that as an opportunity to actually craft, to actually make something, to design that opportunity. How something is acquired has a great deal of impact on how we understand what we own and how we understand what we live with. So the extension of that is really natural. It's also something I didn't start with. I didn't start, I want to make conceptual art, and I think I'll be a potter. It was, I'm a potter, but I'm asking completely new questions about the object. And the new questions about the object are really now what's, like I like to say, when the cool is kiln, when the kiln is cooled, which I love all of that. I love glazes and firing, and it's about 20% of my process. And then the rest is really this, kind of followed intuitively in the same way in a lot of respects. So it's all about making, and even the relationships that are built and the kind of little networks I put together, or there's a craft and a kind of love of that process that's really evident. So it's all connected. In some respects, I would say I'm a production conceptual artist, which gets to be really difficult to manage. That same sense of making 30 cups, I have to have like 5 or 6 projects going at once. And it's just, it's like that is still part of the way that I work. Somebody once said that Jun Kaneko is a production sculptor, and I love that. I think Gail Kendall said that Jun Kaneko is a production sculptor. I mean, he just, huge, massive sculptures, but many, So that doesn't leave, the kind of, the maker, I don't think.
Well, it's funny you say that you've had to find a way to be, to kind of conceptualize being a potter in this whole new way, but you also put really beautifully in our previous conversation something about your work that ties it back to the history of pottery, where he's fond of calling himself the village potter. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think...
Because history, I think that's something else I want to talk a little bit about, is important to all of us, and I think is another conceptual issue that each of you are dealing with in your choice of medium process. But I was really intrigued by that idea of, in a way, your argument that you're reconceiving of what it means to be the village potter.
I'm really fascinated by the kind of, well, at least there's so many different ways that a village potters manifest globally, historically, so many different political situations. But the idea of somebody serving an immediate constituency, like somebody around you that you might know, the idea of making somebody, for somebody who lives next door to you. I kind of have these fantasies, like what if somebody had a real issue, a real concern about how somebody drank too much, and if they just slowly made the steins that he created for them just a little bit less, just maybe a half ounce every 6 months, and slowly he might have, maybe that's not a reality, but I love fantasizing about that kind of service, and that relationship is really important. So, it's all about scale, and we are the wonderful thing about today is that we are such an amazing scale of connectivity, and so the idea of village is no longer Now, the immediacy, I mean, now suddenly you're in Virginia and it seems really intimate that we can, I mean, it's so that idea of being a village potter is really extended in the 21st century with our ability to actually understand intimacy and to be able to connect to somebody. So I love the idea of also extending it into kind of a physical social network and what that means. So I think that's also connected to the idea of village. And I'm also very romantic about that. And I realize the kind of irony in it. And that's sort of one of those internal challenges, a question that's seemingly impossible. Like, to proclaim that you're a village potter for a much larger community. What does that mean?
Well, it's funny because your romanticism interests me because it doesn't so much manifest itself in nostalgia or in aesthetics in the way that we associate romanticism, but in generosity, which is a beautiful thing. So speaking of communities, I actually wanted to ask Elaine specifically because, when I think about you're starting your career 40-some years ago, and deciding to sit down and stitch minimalist canvases at really the height of the minimalist and conceptualist era, as well as we might argue the height of the studio craft era. I'm curious as to, like in retrospect, what you were thinking or what you were feeling about stepping into this very weird zone literally decades before it started to be articulated or theorized the way it is now, the way we take for granted in my scholarship or Glenn's scholarship or Elissa's, Sandra Alfoli's. Because I can't even begin to imagine what, I mean, on the one hand, a studio craft tapestry weavers or maker in fiber, I mean, someone like Lenore Tawney would have thought of what you were doing. But at the other end of the spectrum, these like lead-throwing minimalists that were around you in the New York art world, to say nothing of your professor, Ad Reinhardt, the mind boggles what you must have confronted. And so I'm curious about, and you've stuck it out, about that moment and your commitment to that vision.
That's a much more romantic discussion of the lead-throwing gentleman you referred to was, in fact, I think a year ahead of me at Yale. So, yes, indeed.
The lead thrower who shall remain unnamed.
He was actually a fabulous artist and although difficult, quite a nice man. But the problem was, when I went to graduate school, all my undergraduate colleagues were women. And then when I got to graduate school at Yale, I was one of 3 women in the class and was surrounded in a male college. This is before Yale went co-ed. In a male environment by very accomplished men. I was also had skipped 3 years, so I was younger, a woman, and looked very much like an undergraduate. I was a painter. I'm trained as a painter. I painted when I was in graduate school. When I got out of graduate school, it seemed to me that I was painting to please, and that I had never gone to school to do that, and that in fact I was quite good at school, and that if I wanted to do something, which was with artwork, I would have to claim another territory. And I began to experiment, like many of my contemporaries in the 70s, with the formal issue of materials. And really, embroidery came out of the thread as a disembodied line that pierced the surface of the canvas. It has a very formal history for me. It was an alternative material, just a palpable line, which could both work as relief, as part of the canvas, but had the additional ideation of being anything that lay on the surface, you knew penetrated the surface and went behind. So it had a very interesting Greenbergian relationship to the support. And after my first show, which was, I think, 1975, 1974, I looked at all of these sewn canvases, very formal sewn canvases, and thought, OMG, I'm embroidering. Because I had no idea that that's what I was doing. And then I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? I can go with it, or I can run from it. And so, because it was, how shall I say, it suited my purposes, it was a way. It was, I was very interested, and still continue to be interested, in language and language theory, and the construction of representation, that having this alternative material, this, forgive the art speak, non-reified, or rather despised material, might allow me to construct in an alternative language, to conceive of an alternative history. Or you could say, I don't like that art heaven, I'll make my own art heaven. I don't require 4 stretcher bars for access. And so that is how I began to embroider.
But you were doing this at exactly the moment where artists who were coming to the same conclusions as you, really the beginning of what we might call the postmodern era,
Yeah.
in earnest,
Yes.
were themselves abandoning these
Yes.
media
Yes.
in favor of making these kinds of statements in highly technological or easily mass reproducible
Yes.
materials.
Yes.
How did that?
Well,
I mean, how did that? I don't want to say go over, but I mean, what did you have some confrontations?
oh, sure. Oh, yes, of course. Oh, goodness. She's turned into the embroidery lady. Andrew Chuck Close, who was another classmate, said, oh, I gave up the paintbrush. Well, I gave up paint. It seemed to me that this was a whole way of opening up another history, something, an inclusion. I was interested in inclusion. That, from my political spectrum, or where my belief system was, allowed me to speak in a language which was not a dominant language about things which were not in the dominant culture and could be more inclusive of other histories. And that is both political and feminist or whatever, and it seemed that I could use this. And yes, mostly how the art world, when you're not essentialist either, so you don't fall into a sort of an essentialist category. I actually sew, and I'm pretty good at it.
But you also weren't making femages.
Exactly. Miriam was asking Joyce's mother to the handmade stuff to put in her collages. Joyce Cosler's mother, who was quite an accomplished needlewoman, nor was I organizing teams of women to do the work. I am not being critical, please. Everyone can do exactly the way what they want. This is my choice. Just seemed like I was entitled to do what I pleased.
Well, you were expressing, interestingly, you were expressing your politics in a way very similar to what Joyce was doing with ceramics at around the same time.
Absolutely. And in fact, many people in the P&D movement, and my work was not in the P&D movement, that was a political movement. It's grassroots under, that's at the same time it's heresies. Mm-hmm. And Joyce had been in California. I was in New York. And so she she knew Miriam very well, and Judy Chicago too. She had been, because Max, her husband, was there. But I was in New York pushing strollers down Riverside Drive and working in my studio and reading. And although I am an early member of AIR, which is the first feminist women's cooperative and a model for alternatives galleries. Yes, although, that's a sort of interesting thing about cooperative galleries, how they waves of different people.
Well, while I'm thinking about inclusion, I wanted to bring Sonya into this because your practice is also about inclusion, but of a different variety, I might argue. I mean, your own educational history is really rich. I mean, you have a BA in psychology from Amherst. You have your BFA from School of the Art Institute in fiber.
You don't major in
Oh, I guess-
something but I did major in fiber.
Essentially. You studied with Ann Wilson.
And Nick Cave and Joan Livingstone. It was a great time.
And then you proceeded to go from this like hotbed of early theoretical thinking of craft and education to study with Gerhard Nodal at Cranbrook, who had also taught Anne, one of your mentors.
Anne and Joan and Nick. Yeah.
So your practice comes from a very different kind of desire to include this spectrum of your education and of your interests. Can you talk a little bit about how those have come together in your various practices or objects or whatever?
So if I'm understanding, are you saying that Elaine came to textiles in a different way, and I went head on into textiles?
Oh no,
that's
no.
not-
I think that
okay.
you both came at it from.
I'm just trying to understand your question.
I mean,
Yeah.
you came at it from different scholarly and maybe even theoretical traditions. But in your case, I'm interested in the fact that you have liberal arts and fine arts. The fact that
Yeah.
your spectrum of mentors were from across the craft, across generations as well as practices of craft history. And I'm curious as to how you feel that has affected what you do.
Yeah, so in one of the previous talks, someone used this beautiful word, generative. I love that word. You wrote it down too, I saw. Yeah.
Well, and that's
Cheating,
that's
yeah.
Elaine. In our
Yeah,
conversations,
yeah.
she said that that this process is extremely generative, which
That's
I thought
right.
was beautiful.
So there's something about the way in which I was educated, both at here, frankly, in the school that I went to here in D.C., and then that led to going to a liberal arts school, where I was taught to find linkages between things at all cost. In fact, it's always sort of a challenge for me. Like, how is that connected to that? How many degrees do you have to step to get that connected to that? And I can almost always do it. So that's one way of thinking about it, how to connect dots between things. But the other way is to take any one thing and realize that it is, in fact, connected to everything. So not to connect dots in between, but to realize the whole ocean is in the drop of water. Both of those things are ways, I guess, theoretical ways of approaching objects, approaching materials, and approaching culture. And if I could have, I would have gotten a degree in like material culture or something like that. But there was no such degree in the late 80s when I was in undergraduate school. And my degree in psychology, I also did a minor in African studies, where I was really interested in the objects and what those objects meant within culture. When I went to the Art Institute of Chicago for a second bachelor's degree, I knew that I wanted to study textiles because I understood that textiles had this weightiness to them, this depth of history that was kind of an easy droplet of water to mine. And in fact, all of the things that I go through are like that. Hair, it's easy. We can all have a conversation about hair. We can all have a conversation about textiles.
We've all got it. We all miss it.
Yeah,
We don't
right. You either have it or you don't have it. You either comb it or you don't comb it. But it's a place where there's a lot of potential connectivity and therefore very generative. Then I want to say something about history too. Because one of the things that I'm in the privileged space of being middle-aged, being over 40, and having this generation that I get to work with. I love working in a university because the traditionally aged students are younger than I am normally, and the way in which they see the world and reflect that back at me is generative. And the way in which the 60-year-old and 70-year-old artists reflect and see the world and give that back to me is generative. And then spin it way out. We all work in mediums that are so old that it literally is generative, like ancestral relationships to these materials. And that spectrum is, it's just pure joy for me. It's pure joy.
Well, it's funny you say that, because in our conversations, you put this issue particularly beautifully when you talked about your studio process, and you said, my studio is crowded with ancestors. And, to which Michael kind of responded that, and I'll quote, history is the fuel for my conceptual engine. Yes. So maybe we should talk about history, maybe begin with Michael, and the way in which it fuels what you do, and maybe even what you're doing right now.
Yeah, sure. Well, history linked to the actual use and function of the object, and the tradition of that is really, obviously, it's really powerful. And I love Pete Pimentel, who is one of my professors at Nebraska, has this great talk on cups, and it talks about the intimacy of the object, and so that sort of potential, like you're talking about, this sort of intersection, this place of common ground, as conceptual fuel is like really fascinating. There's so much you can do with that. So I'll give you an example. So with this piece on the right, where it's this project where people come in with a cup with a story, and they exchange that object, the object that I make, for the object they bring in. So this is a guy who spends 2 years in prison and 1 year out of prison. And the story is that he used this cup every day in prison. It has his name inscribed on it, and he used it for 1 year out of prison. And that's what was really fascinating to me, like 1 year out, and you use it every day. And so rather than the cup being something that he acquires, that he purchases, and it's that the cup that that I made, which is that's where the village potter comes in, is for a different purpose. It's decidedly outside of market too. That's the other thing I need to make like this is purposefully, and can't be part of market. I can't sell this. You can't sell that in the story. Are you kidding me? I mean, anyway, so this exchange will always be linked. I like to think of it that way. So that the meaning of that cup and the exchange and the cathartic moment for him can't be in any way symbolized or reflected. It can only happen in the moment. And this is something that Glenn said yesterday about that kind of work that's in the moment. And so I think that's what the history of ceramics is. It's always in the moment of what you're consuming, of functional ceramics. So like that little space, that little intersection between how we acquire something and how we use it it's just so much, like you're talking about. It's just so much just right there to work from as a platform, as a place. And so that's specifically what I mean. And then I think there's just so many other like possibilities within that history to just focus in on one thing and look at how it intersects with humanity and focus on that. One little side note on this, this was during a big opening, and there's 250 people that were at the opening, and it was this exchange that was live, so it happened over the course of about an hour and a half, and people would read them, and there'd be conversation. It really was a community event. And when he put this up, this is my favorite piece from that project. When he there's a lot of really profound and some goofy pieces, but when he put this up, you could see how the crowd, I could just see it in their mind, how they flipped from their association of ex-con as what they had objectified to a human being, and it was this amazing moment where like 200 people just, like he was kind of it was no longer about me, which I loved. I just sort of like drifted into the background. It was about that moment, and I can only facilitate that. And so that's where the kind of history and the potter and that comes in.
Sonya? Maybe in regards to work you've been making lately, how is the history's been functioning in a way that's fueled some of your recent work?
It always fuels all the work. So, I mean, even there's a way in which people will say, so you started in textiles and now you work with combs, what happened? Right? And I still always work with textiles, and I always work with hair, and combs are just the newer thing that people notice. But even the answer to that question is a historical one. What was the first textile art form? And I landed at hairdressing. So the rest is like commonplace. Of course, then you're going to work with hair as a fiber, and then combs as the tool that you find on a loom that you use for your own hair care, all of that. I'm really quite simple-minded. But I think that there's a lot in a simple question. So in the more recent work, I've been, instead of mining the material itself, thinking about textile history, I've been using combs and thinking, what do combs imply as material cultural objects? And thinking that these small pocket combs that are fine-toothed tell you something about the kind of hair that they're intended for, tell you something about that hygiene, or at least the appearance of hygiene, is so important that it needs to be kept in your pocket so you can be, look hygienic at all times. Plastic, well, we know we're entirely too petroleum-based. And I'm going to hell for making work out of plastic combs, I know this, but we're going to have a good party there. So those of you who know you're coming too.
We like to think you're actually you're creating works that won't be in the landfill, that they will be up on walls, and hopefully a conservator's dream for all eternity.
Yes, all eternity. All eternity. So mining the history of the object and the newer work, but then also mining the history of the process. So going to hair styling and thinking, what does it mean to have a hairstyle that is owned by a culture in a way? So like cornrowing, kind of owned by my people, right? Or the evident part of my people, African, and not so much the Scottish side. So so using the technique of fiber hair braiding to stand in for a whole cultural presence, right? So it doesn't actually have to be hair. It can just be the technique of hairdressing that stands in for that history. Right?
But I've always been so impressed with not just your sense of wonder and curiosity about these histories, but your sense of responsibility. Because I remember, actually, let me go back. I remember bumping into you, and there's one of her comb pieces, that's Madame C.J. Walker piece is made with hair combs. I remember bumping into you at a feminist dinner, and my saying, well, what are you up to? And you said, you got very serious, and you said, I'm thinking about braiding a Confederate flag.
It's serious work.
Yes.
I live in Richmond, Virginia. What you do to the Confederate flag, this is,
And being so impressed with the ways in which the responsibility with which you obviously felt this idea, the responsibility with which you were saddled with this idea, and your desire to do it right. And your awareness of how it would go over. And I don't even think it was just Richmond, Virginia, but just your responsibility to the history that it represented.
Well, to be honest, I was pissed. Because the Governor Bob McDonnell had done some sort of declaration in 2010 of April as being Confederate History Month. And I thought, where the hell have I moved? And yet I know exactly where I've moved. I mean, Richmond has this deep history as the capital of the Confederacy, and so I said, okay, all right, so I'm angry, so what do I do about that? What am I actually angry about? And the thing, I actually didn't mind that he was acknowledging the history of the place. I don't have a problem with that. What I minded was that in his proclamation, he left out African Americans' part to play and slavery. And that they was like, what? That didn't happen, right? And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to reinsert the African-American presence and say we couldn't have gotten to the American flag of the 50 stars and the 13 stripes without the African-American presence. And so, that troubling statement turned into, okay, so how do we acknowledge that there's this history, but it's being described in this way history leaves a lot of stuff out, that's leaving something out that's essential to who we are collectively. And so that's where that piece came from.
And what about Madame C.J. Walker? Because written about her history and how conflicting it is. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to create this portrait, specifically of this, and if you want to explain to
Sure,
folks
so
who she is.
the 2-second version of who, 2-second virgin, that's a whole nother panel.
That's a Madonna pop song, I think.
The 2-second version of who Madame C.J. Walker is that this is a woman who was born, a black woman who was born in 1868, so a few years after the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. She was, her parents clearly were enslaved. By the time she died in 1919, she was purported to be one of the first self-made women millionaires. Often you'll hear her that qualified as black women millionaires, which is true, of course, because she was a black woman, but she was one of the first self-made women millionaires. She made her money through hair care products. She is loved, and sometimes the haters are out there because she is acknowledged as teaching or popularizing straightening African American hair as one of the beauty rituals. I'm completely enamored with this woman. I think it's incredible what she was able to do because she was political. And hair salons were political places. They were places where black people could gather and nobody paid attention, right? So there was all this political activism that was happening around hair before afros became the symbol of political activism. So sure, she was teaching people how to straighten hair, yes, but she was also talking about anti-lynching campaigns in those hair salons. So it's this sort of complexity.
Right.
And so I used fine-tooth combs because of the hair straightening issue. And also because I think those combs are gendered. It's more likely that a man would carry one than a woman. And she was navigating a man's world. She was sitting in boardrooms at a time before women could vote and certainly long before before black people could vote. And so she's a phenomenal woman, which is why I had to make a larger-than-life tapestry of her. So does that answer that
It
question?
does.
Yeah.
And Elaine, your work lately has been very much getting into history, ancient history, with your interest in mythology and classical art, classical history, but also ways in which it's been interpreted and reinterpreted eternally in the contemporary art world. But of course, the contemporary art world going back at least to the Renaissance. Can you talk a little bit about that very long history that you're dealing with?
Well, I've always been involved in alternative histories. If you're involved in the way in which people read Native Americans or the history of samplers or all of those things, you are involved in an alternative history. But lately I've been hanging out with the bad Minoan girls. I mean, I am a product of very long psychoanalysis, and my conclusion is, who needs Freud if you have the myths? And the way that the myths are threaded literally together is fascinating. It's the same kind of, it's reading and retelling gives you power over the narrative. He who gets to speak is the one who tells the story, who has the power. So my work is made up of the juxtaposition between image and text, and the meaning resides in the space, in the interstices between the image and the text. The Greek origins for text and textaire are the same, that's the same origin. And also the political history of textiles is deeply woven into Greek culture because it's the language of politics. It's the warp and the woof coming together. It's when a political treaty was made, there was a cloth woven. You can't get married. I mean, one of the reasons that Bacchus and Ariadne or Theseus and Ariadne were not a certified union is they never got married under a cloth. There's a marriage cloth involved. So textiles has a whole deep, resonant Greek history. And myths have a whole threaded, involuted, reinterpreted kind of how Ariadne is perceived from an opera by Handel and John Curran and myself are different things. And the text is Why can't I read my own text?
Oh, I'm a little closer, and I'll try to read it in as theatrical a voice as I
The
can.
women of Minos.
No daughter of Minos has ever got off lightly in love. Sin is always attached.
And Seneca
Quote from
wrote
Seneca.
that. And the way in which it's a feminist to also send up it's a repartee with John Curran also, in which I reproduce his poster of Ariadne. This is his Ariadne. It was a poster for the opera that existed as a painting before, so it's already mediated through a kind of, there's an opera, there's a painting, there's a poster, there's an embroidery that literally threads these all together with a quote from Seneca made to look like a poster. And frankly, the colors are so heated that I make the woman even more garish and unappetizing than she appears in the portrait.
Well, maybe a perfect place to conclude is thinking, as you are in work like this, about how the past maybe anticipates the future. Since this whole symposium is about craft futures, I'd like for each of you to conclude with one thing in, I guess, this merger of contemporary art and craft that excites you about its future.
I have a company. For years, I had no company in the art world, and now I have lots of company, and I couldn't be happier.
Oh, you go next. I have to think.
Well, I wrote this down, so I'm just going to, this is like me reading my very short paper. And it addresses your question amazingly. It's like we were melded there for a minute. It would be not to make ceramics appear to be art, but to leverage its very history and nature as an entry point into the heart and minds of the people as an oppositional force to prevailing wisdom. And that wisdom, I believe, is this sort of the efficiency that is pressing down on our culture as a kind of standard of how we should exist. One of the things that we beautifully do is create strategic, and I love this term, and I have this little secret society called the Global Institute of Strategic Inefficiency. And, and if you want to join,
I was going to
Facebook
say, I want to
me.
subscribe to that newsletter.
And nothing has happened yet, I can tell you, because that would undermine the very nature. But sometime you'll see something extremely inefficient and profound. But that kind of, like what we are is strategically inefficient in our culture, and that's our role, and to continue that, and to continue being that prevailing force against what is, to oppose. That's part of what it means to even, to choose to be in ceramics as a political decision.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Let's see. I've said this before, I'll say it again, because it's what I feel is the thing that excites me the most about the field, is that the more that we know of our roots, which are as deep as they are in the textiles of Greek history, or as deep as they are in any of our histories and any of our mediums, those deep roots allow for really, really expansive branches. So what I'm seeing is that across this art and craft thing, that art recognizes its roots in craft, and so the branches are extending in this way that we say, oh, look, there we are. But we've always been there. It's the same DNA, actually. It's the same DNA in art and craft. I don't think it's different. It's just whether the acknowledgement is there. And as we explore those roots, our branches will continue to get broader and broader, and there's exciting work that's coming from that.
It's a beautiful place to end. Thank you. And please help me thank these beautiful artists. I'm guessing at this point that Elissa and Joanna...
Everybody comes to the stage.
Yeah, we'll get really snuggle, yeah.
Actually, are those mics on?
Well, probably, yeah.
Yeah, should we just stand?
Why don't we just
Oh, yeah, I guess the webcast for the folks at home.
Ready for questions?
They're all the mics.
Is this mic on? Yes. Okay, good. My question is primarily, but not entirely, for the last panel. And I'm interested in the next generation, people coming along. By the way, I'm Gary Stevens, and I'm on the board of the James Renwick Alliance, the support organization for the Renwick Gallery. And my question is, for your students and the young artists that you know, the up-and-comers, how does craft or crafting enter into their thinking, if at all?
First off, I'll answer by saying, ask a young artist. All of us are over 40. So we wouldn't have gotten into the craft show, but before anybody answers, I'm sure they all have amazing ideas. I can see some of my and these folks, students and former students, find a young person and ask them. It's something as a feminist scholar, I've always harped on, that most of my research is about intergenerational divides in feminism. And, Gloria Steinem has this sort of quip where she says, they're always asking me, what are young feminists thinking? And I just have to say, ask a young feminist. And I would say, once we get the wisdom from this panel, which is true, find a young person and ask them.
Well taken, but I still want to answer.
Since we're stuck with the old guard.
Yeah, since we're the ones who have the stage today.
Well, I think the panel last night really began to address the issue, and that is that I'm faced with a lot of students who really just don't know how to make stuff. And that's actually it's not because they don't want to, it's because they just haven't been exposed to a lot of actual kind of manual dexterity. And so I find that it is a disconnect, but what they do come in with is a lot of conceptual ideas, So what I anticipate, or what I see happening, is that students, rather than picking an area, this is the difficulty in art education right now, rather than picking an area, they're leading with ideas, and I think because that's exactly where they're at. They have students who say, I want to be a potter, but I want to be I love ceramics because I did it once in high school, but really I want to conceptualize what a 3-minute movie will look like, and can I do that out of clay, and how can I make that into a video? And so it's a really interesting transition. Part of it, I think, is related to just not making. At least in North Dakota. Now, this is...
So I chair a craft department, so they come to me already wanting to do that. So really that points to, and you know this, of course, and so that really points to ask the students what drew them to this. But I think you're quite right. I actually think there's a longing for making things that is happening. We talk about the pendulum swinging. And the other thing that I would say is that I think that the students I'm seeing are incredibly dexterous, but they're dexterous in different materials. Their thumbs are really fast.
True.
I'm serious. I can't text nearly as fast as this generation can, and I'm pretty good at it. But so they're incredibly dexterous, and they have great ideas. And so this is about that extension of branches. I think there's a way in which they are actually really drawn to working with their hands in a different way. And they know that there's a sort of interesting, maybe even retro power in the materials. What we were talking about this at breakfast. You see the 70s come back and you go, okay. You see them come back again and you think, oh God, how old am I? But so there, that replay, that there's a sort of evolution and revolution, and that happen in the 20 or so years that I've been teaching, that I see people have this interest in the hand. But they're not doing the same thing I did. They're in a different place because it's a different generation and they have something else to offer us.
I think it's me. I'm Susie, and I work things out while I'm talking, so I'm not sure this is going to end in a question.
Yeah.
But it's in response to, mostly to you, Michael, and just like you linked it to the panel last night, I was so struck by how what you're doing and what you're kind of proposing in your work is such a kind of a traditional craft way of the Fab Labs. I think it's kind of, it's amazing how, the things that you got up there and said that, you know, you're viewing manufacture, first of all, viewing pottery as manufacture, utilitarian pots, which it clearly is, and also as a service industry. I thought it was a great anecdote about, you know, what the possibilities are of that. And then thinking about how the speaker was talking last night about how his MIT students were coming up with these creative responses in their lab. So I guess I'm interested in your thinking about that, you know, what you're doing in relation to the Fab Lab, and maybe to add to that.
Yeah, actually, I have a group called Engage U at the university I'm at, and what Engage U does is basically break down boundaries between, like, last semester there was a mass comm student, an architectural grad student, several students from different areas, and the idea is just to leverage where everybody's at to in making, and everything's around making, but the idea of bringing everybody together to do that and to solve a problem. And so I think one of the great potentials in our economy, I'm saying that, is social entrepreneurialism. I mean, that social entrepreneurialism isn't about giving stuff away or not making a living. It's about finding a new avenue for work. So I'm going to give you one really quick example. And I have a student who just graduated, an undergrad, Meg Roberts, who has started a project. Now, it deals with abortion. It's an amazing project. What she has done is create a project, and I'll just go really quickly. She makes planters that hold succulent plants. They're cactus. And as a woman leaves the procedure, I know this because my wife went through a DNC. We lost a child. It's a very empty feeling, right, at that moment. But she offers the opportunity to take something living with them in a handmade object, and then has created a kind of support network around that. And then it's kind of grown, and it's amazing because on some level both pro-life and pro-choice individuals have donated to her now legal nonprofit, which is, you tell me where that has ever happened. Right. And that's a potter, right? And it's just leveraging, again, the kind of the making of something, thinking about how acquisition is the key, and then just dealing with that. And then actually working with what you value, which is one of the things that addresses the other question, which is what do you value and how do you connect that to what you make? But that's a really good example. Now, for instance, I think a lot of places gauge how many grad students have you had, and I've come up with this really strange rubric, which is one nonprofit, legal nonprofit that's working is like 4 grad students, or something like that. You know, so yeah, like so if I get if I get a nonprofit made every year, that's a pretty great kind of factory of goodness, you know.
And I mean, this is not actually another question, maybe, but just to kind of translate that same kind of thing that you're talking about, which is what I think you crystallized right there, and just kind of to connect it to the panel from last night, is what I think was really inspiring about talking about these MIT students and talking about it specifically within the context of Haystack, was that like transformational moment where you demonstrate one object into another. And I find it really inspiring to bring out that moment of acquisition, you know, kind of in the like spirit of, you know, Michaeli Csikszentmihalyi, kind of, you know, recognizing our objects and really animating kind of what all of you guys have been talking about, taking the history of material culture and animating it and making it vital and expansive and branching. And anyway, I really appreciated your guys' panel. Thank you.
Right on.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Susie. Yeah.
Sorry, Elissa, I am going to throw a question at you. I'm Jenny Sorkin. I'm speaking later today. I'm really struck by this continuum that seems to be the sort of meta-narrative of this panel of craft as a support system of some sort. And I'm interested in, I guess, Elissa and maybe Elaine sort of elucidating, for me at least, the idea of if craft becomes a kind of self-help or self-sustaining community that I think Josh Faught in his work is trying to work out, this problem of community in relation to sort of the isolation of the individual. I'm wondering, what does that unmake the generation previous, sort of the work of Elaine Reichek, whose work is fiercely individualistic and really a kind of a vision that was uncompromising over a long period of time. So and obviously there's a relationship to the larger history of, you know, obviously Josh Faught has read The Subversive Stitch, and Elaine is working out of that well. So is this a kind of unmaking, remaking? Is Josh breaking down the work of practitioners like Elaine, or is he just adding on?
Okay, I think there's maybe a couple of questions in there. First, let me just address the self-help aspect, because there's a lot of comments or references in all of Faught's work, at least it seems to me, about the self-help movement, its emergence, what it offers to people. I think he's very curious about that phenomenon and about the kinds of people that seek self-help. And so you'll find sometimes books related to self-help, kind of therapies, et cetera, in his work. I don't think he necessarily participates in anything that we would think of as self-help, but he certainly is curious about it as an American phenomenon, and so it shows up in a lot of the work. And I think it's probably also related to his interest in feeling and emotions and things that are and he tries to communicate that through actual objects or actual techniques. So, but I think, again, he has a kind of ambivalent relationship to it. Now say again what you mean by his relationship to, say Elaine's work, or where were you going with that?
I guess I'm going with the idea of this almost an environment, and he's making this environment. It's something that we see over and over again in a younger generation of artists who feel the need to scale up their work. So I guess I'm interested in, does that detract from unmake, remake, work against, in some way, the more sort of individualistic, the scale, I guess, that Elaine works on? Is it an admiration, or is it a way to actually rework or make bigger as a way of working against a previous generation? I guess I'm interested in Elaine's, actually, since Elaine is somebody who looks at this work all the time. Would you mind just talking?
Well, the seduction of scale is something I'm not unfamiliar with. Having made 60 feet of curtain, a large-scale tapestry, scale up. It gets attention. But it's a different practice. I am not involved in the example of the village embroideress is Hester Prynne. And frankly, I think I have better taste in men. So it's just a flip answer to that. But yes, we were talking before about people who have inherently different kinds of personalities. I am ill-equipped, and the parameters of my practice do not include that kind of community extension. I can't do it. I don't have those particular set of social skills that you move so liquidly and easily through, and are so privileged to be able to work in community with many people. And I think Sonya has them also, to run a department, to have many colleagues. And when I referred to myself as a studio dinosaur, I meant that essentially I make all my work. And even if I give it to a mill in Belgium, I program the disc. They're just executing it. And it made me so miserably uncomfortable, I don't know if I'll ever do it again. It's a different, people work out of who they are. And they are, each of us designs a life, or hopefully creates a life, that is suitable for who they are, and an extension, as you are, each of us a prisoner of their product. Your practice can't be everything to everyone. And often younger artists, it's said that the more I went into my studio and I came out in an art army, which means you were waving a flag for abstract painting, you were waving a flag for sculpture, you were waving a flag for messy craft. That's something in which the work itself is an extension of who you are, and then further defines where you stand.
The one thing I was going to add about scale is that for Faught, if he is thinking about these things in relation to the history of fiber, which he probably is, I should ask him about this. It's those large scale, what he would probably call like crazy, monstrous, shaggy things from the the early 70s that he really loves. So that's probably where that's coming in. But it feels more just about his. My gut reaction is to just say he's an artist who came of age in the 90s and is very interested in like installation in general. Right, because you immerse yourself in a stage or a kind of fantasy, and so scale is necessarily part of that.
I spent a long time at this show. I would say he also has, it's a taste affectation also. I mean, this is somebody I would believe loves macrame, a big shag carpet, and a retro kind of decor, but also as a gay man wonders how that intense period, it's a period in which your social activity in New York was going to funerals, how that all came about, and I can't look at certain artists' work because I lived through this period, but there is a kind of nostalgia factor in some communities about when people came to New York and the promise of a free and open and accepting society. What happened with the AIDS epidemic, and where are those activists now? I think there's also some nostalgia in that too.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't old enough to be there, and so when he had that experience seeing the film We Were Here, if I highly recommend it, it's really quite an amazing documentary. He said, first of all, I think seeing it in San Francisco at the Castro Theater was traumatic for him because he didn't know those stories. He knew the story of ACT UP, et cetera, but the homegrown networks that had to be created to manage the epidemic by gay men and lesbians in San Francisco, this was something that he had never heard of and was profoundly moved by that and truly wanted to create some sort of immersive experience where you might be able to capture the feeling of what that was like. So, I mean, I hesitate to refer to it as nostalgia just because within theory circles, nostalgia and sentimentality is a very sort of like bad word or bad connection. But there's an earnestness to it. That's the word that I like.
Yeah, so much of Josh's work strikes me as being about comfort, and seeking comfort in the midst of this kind of trauma. So, and we have 2 questions. I was hoping we have time to get to them. So.
Sure. So my question is also for Elissa, and it sort of builds off of what you were just talking about in terms of activism. I'm Danny Orndorff, by the way. I'm a writer and curator from Chicago. So what interested me, and it's less of a question, more of a compliment to your presentation and also to Josh's work, is this coupling of craft and activism and queerness in a much more nuanced way than I think a lot of work that we've seen recently. And what struck me by grouping sort of ephemera of ACT UP and with the sort of home how-to books and craft manuals and this kind of thing, was it seems to me that there exists a real interesting way of thinking about combating biopower through different kinds of techniques. So the idea of self-care and of homegrown manuals of self-knowledge and understanding and mechanisms for, combating neglected sorts of the neglect of an institution like the medical complex and everything else. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to this idea of self-care, and how that maybe ties in to the histories of activism here that that Josh is presenting and that you've talked about.
That's a great question, and I should have an answer to that, but it's sort of a part of the paper that I'm still thinking about, and because it's so obvious that it's sort of there. I actually came through to the self-help books and the craft books which I also have a collection of. I mean, talk about nostalgia for my own historical project, right?
Goodness, I
Yeah.
feel like I'm stigmatized by that world, but for me, having lived through it,
Yeah.
there is,
Yeah.
there's this other edge, and yes, I like the work.
Right. I actually was coming at it more, thinking more about the revolution, like the how-to revolution in book publishing that is deeply, intimately connected with the American counterculture. Because the first how-to books, whether you're building domes, whether you're building inflatable architecture,
Dungeons.
yeah, okay, all of that comes straight out of that that publishing revolution, which is about returning power to the people, right? And the utopian aspirations to build a new civilization from scratch by giving individuals the knowledge that they need to do that. So that's where I was coming from in speaking. That's what attracted me, part of what attracted me to the exhibition, and that's also something that I had been working on for the counterculture in general for quite some time. So that was what was on my mind. But you're getting to something that I think is also there, much more complex, and probably the next stage. I am going to expand this, so the next stage of that. So thanks for bringing it up. Yeah.
I look forward to it.
Hi, my name is Rob Hitzig. I'm an artist and writer from Vermont. I had a question for Joanna. And one of the issues that I'm really interested in is how a decision is made where a work of art goes. For example, if you go upstairs, you could see the Martin Puryear piece, Bauer, which is using furniture making and boat building techniques to make a work of contemporary art. Whereas if you go to the Renwick and look at Wendell Castle's Ghost Clock, it seems to be purely a work of sculpture. And are there political reasons or cost reasons, or is it an issue of dealing with certain artists about where work goes? I mean, would Martin Puryear be upset if you moved his piece? Okay. And well, anyway, can you just speak to that issue?
Sure. Yes, it's all of those things factor into where a work goes. And I feel like Nicholas should be up here addressing this question with me because he and I are struggling with that together. The Nick Cave is a terrific example of an artist who I have long been very interested in and was pursuing for the contemporary collection. And when I happened to mention this, I think as a kind of aside to Nicholas, he said, oh, well, I'm equally interested in Nick Cave's work, as is the JRA, and they would like to support the purchase of a sound suit. And so we began collaboratively looking for a piece to bring into the collection with the understanding that it would be quote-unquote shared. So its time in our galleries would be divided between the Patent Office building here, and it will be on view by the end of this month, and then it would go to the Renwick for a certain amount of time. Other determinations certainly sort of factor in. In some cases, an artist approaches the Renwick specifically and wants their work to be shown in that collection. In other cases, for instance, the 40 Under 40 show, I know Nicholas has been working very hard to bring in acquisitions from that exhibition, and I'm eager to show some of them in the contemporary galleries on the third floor of this building, which I hope you'll be amenable to.
Absolutely.
But I think that, again, I walk through the 40 Under 40 show, and I don't see craft artists. I just see contemporary artists around me, and I want to co-opt them and bring them into my space or our spaces in this building.
I think that's perfectly valid, and I think I actually upset perhaps George Gurney, who was our just recently retired sculpture curator here a few years ago, when I told him that I would basically get my hands on any objects that he didn't bolt down to the floor in this building and drag them over to the Renwick sooner or later, because I like to think of us more as an object museum than a craft museum a lot of the time. Joanna and I are both fairly new to this museum. I think we've been here for about 5 years, which may sound longer to you, but if you work at the Smithsonian, that's like about a day. A lot of people are here for 30 or more years. And so I think we both sort of walked into a situation where things had already been divided. And we've both spent some time looking at which buildings things live in and wondering, well, why is that exactly, and what do we do about that? And acquiring the Nick Cave piece together was really the first time where we got together actively and said, how do we resolve this in a way? We're kind of in a funny situation because a lot of people don't realize that the Renwick is a department of the American Art Museum. We are, in fact, one museum. We only have one collection. There is no differentiation between works that are in the Renwick or in American art in any means except geographically, which is what makes that so complicated. So we often have to explain to constituents that we're not really technically sharing the Nick Cave because it's only ever in one collection. It's just that we have to kind of ship it back and forth across downtown for people to understand that it has sort of these multiple personalities within the museum. And Jennifer and Julie really spoke well to that yesterday, I think, as well. In terms of Puryear, he would certainly not be amenable, I don't think, to having that piece move. For those of you that don't know, his brother Michael Puryear is a furniture maker. And so you get into some sort of tricky politics even within families in that regard.
I think one of the things Nicholas and I are both excited about, although we haven't talked specifically about, is the Renwick renovation, which will happen when?
We close at the end of January 2014, so in just over a year.
Okay, just over a year from now. And what that can mean for integrating our collections
we haven't
here
talked about
in
that.
the Patent Office building, for at least for the time that the Renwick is closed for that renovation. And I think it will enable us to explore a lot of different juxtapositions and intersections.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, Rebecca, you have the last question, and then we need to go
That's
lunch.
a heavy burden. This is a question for Elaine. It occurred to me when we were talking about this younger artist who hadn't lived through the AIDS epidemic and so on, and he saw this film and it was revelatory. My question to you is, did you know about the deep history of textiles when you were at Yale? I mean, Annie Albers, who was married to Joseph Albers, had the first retrospective one-person show at MoMA in 1949. Sheila Hicks was there in the late 50s, early 60s. Were you aware of that at the time?
I didn't know about Sheila Hooks.
You did not?
I knew about Lenore Tawney because she shared the same Coenti slip studio upstairs from Agnes Martin. And so I knew about that relationship.
But not when you were at Yale? That was
No,
after
not
you
when I
graduated.
was at Yale. It was afterwards, in a self-help, self-education way, that I needed to read and immerse myself in another history, an alternative art history for an alternative art heaven. And that is when, because in art history classes, they do not teach you this other history. It is simply you start with, it's now world art, but it used to start with, I don't know, pre-Giotto and run the French line. I have the regular French line, art history, the classic one in which, Cimabue to Giotto to whatever. No, that history, that was in the history of the decorative arts. But then again, we didn't have film studies or certainly material culture or technology courses or all of this, and theory. There's Greenberg, there's Michael Fried,
Greenberg, right.
but there is not Lacan, Bailey, Derrida. These are, this is self-education, which is what people, I guess everyone of a certain age, just keeps reading and reading and reading. So no, I didn't. In fact, I recently met Sheila Hicks in Sao Paulo. And was really, I knew of her work. I think I had run across her in Paris, but this is the first time I have ever shown with her or anything like that. No. didn't.
That's an indictment of our education system.
It
that
is
I think
indeed.
Sonya and Michael
Absolutely.
are correcting now.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Let's give a hand for this morning. Brilliant. We resume at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I encourage you to check out our cafe in the courtyard upstairs. It just has a new menu.
I am too.
And
Me too,
also
by the way.
the catalogs and the 40 under 40 posters, silk screened, are for sale outside this afternoon as well. And we'll see